Hello, my name is Yukie Nagai. I'm working at the University of Tokyo. It's my great honor to have this opportunity to present our research achievement. I'd like to especially thank the organizers to make this very special conference happen. What I'm going to talk is the cognitive development in human and robot. Many robotics researchers have been designing the cognitive mechanism for robots inspired by the human intelligence. In this talk, I'd like to share our neural-inspired mechanism, which enable robots to show their human-like, the childlike development. We know from developmental studies that human children acquire various cognitive abilities in the first few years of life. They acquire the ability, for example, to control their body in an intentional manner, and then they learn to manipulate an object. These self-oriented motor behaviors are then utilized to communicate with others. They learn to infer the goal and intention of others, and then cooperate with others. Inspired by the child development, we robotics researchers have been designing their various types of their abilities for robots. Especially in the research field called cognitive developmental robotics, the researchers have been investigating what kind of mechanism enable robots to acquire their various cognitive behaviors like human child. And then by doing so, we also aimed at better understanding the underlying neural mechanism for the cognitive development. Especially in my research, we are targeting the research aim to gain what the ideas of their cognitive architecture or the neural mechanism would enable humans' inference as well as robots to acquire their continuous and the various cognitive abilities. And our main research question is there a unified principle for the cognitive development? We think that there are two important aspects in the development. The first one is the continuity in the development. As you have seen in the previous slides, the human child first acquires self-oriented, non-social behaviors. And then based on this ability, they learn to communicate with others as in social behaviors. So the question is, how the social behaviors emerges based on their non-social behavior. And second important aspect is the diversity. We know that some children shows a very typical time scale of the development, whereas the other children shows the difficulties in acquiring their cognitive abilities. For example, children who have autism spectrum disorders shows the difficulties in communicating with others. So the research question is, what is the principle that can account for both their continuity and diversity in the development? As a potential hypothesis of this principle, we have been focusing on the theory called predictive coding, which was originally proposed by neuroscientists. Here, the key idea is that the human brain works as a predictive machine, and it tries to minimize the prediction error. For example, when we perceive the world, when we receive the sensory signal as an incoming, the bottom-up signal. But our brain does not simply rely on this incoming sensory signal, but rather we make the predictions about the sensory signal, which is generated by the internal model. This internal model is updated through our own sensory motor experiences, especially by utilizing the prediction error as a difference between the top-down prediction and the bottom-up sensory signal. The internal model learns to better perceive the world. And the interesting point of this model is that the action production is also explained in the same manner. From the body, we receive their proprioceptive signals as a bottom-up sensory signal, but then our internal model makes the predictions about the proprioceptive signals. And the prediction error between these two signals are utilized to update the motor output, which resulted in their action outcome. And the additional important hypothesis here is a Bayesian inference. When we integrate the top-down predictions and the bottom-up sensory signal, we utilize the Bayesian theory. Here, the yellow Gaussian distributions represent the plier with some uncertainty. The variance of the Gaussian distributions correspond to the uncertainty of the plier. And then the bottom-up sensory signal is also represented as a Gaussian distribution with some noises. And according to the Bayesian brain hypothesis, our perception or posteriors is created as an integrations of the top-down plier and the bottom-up sensory signal based on their uncertainty. So let me give you one example to demonstrate how your brain also works as a predictive machine. This is a very famous optical illusion. You can see the green cylinder placed on a checkerboard. Here the question is, which area, region A or B, looks brighter? I guess many of you would answer that B looks brighter. However, once I introduce the two gray bar, you recognize that these two regions have exactly same luminance. So it means that at the bottom-up sensory signal, these two regions have exactly the same sensory information. But however, your perception is modified by your plier. Here the plier is created based on their surrounding information and also your previous knowledge about this kind of the checkerboard, and also how the shadow would make the environment darker. So this example nicely demonstrates that your brain also works in a predictive manner, but then how and to what extent we can utilize this theory to explain the continuity and the diversity of the development as an open question. So in the first part, I'd like to focus on the continuity of the development, how social behaviors may develop based on the non-social self-motor experiences. As a target behavior, I'd like to focus on the altruistic behaviors, which appears around the 14 months old age. This is an experiment conducted at Max Planck Institute, and the researchers investigated at what age and how children start helping others. Here you can see that this boy was so kind. He opened the door so that the experimenter put the books into the shelf. In another scenario, the experimenter dropped a clothespin here, and the boy who was observing the experimenter's behavior spontaneously started helping their person and then gave their clothespin to the experimenter. Here, the important point is that children have never received their social feedback or reward. They spontaneously help the other persons who need help. So the question is, what motivates children to help others? What is their underlying mechanism for the child altruistic behavior? I think the one of the evidence which can support this idea is that the mirror neuron system or mirror neurons. The neuroscientists have found that some groups of the neurons in case of monkey, the neurons in the prefrontal cortex found that they activate not only when the monkey or humans produces actions, but also when they observe other persons is performing that actions. So which indicate that our motor neurons are utilized not only to generate action, but also to infer the other person's goal and the action outcomes. And we suggest that this mirror neurons provides a very nice neural mechanism which enable human child and also the robot to show their social behaviors. And then we started designing the computational neural network model, which can acquire the mirror neuron-like capabilities. As a potential, the mechanism for the mirror neuron system, we here introduce the deep autoencoder. One of the important characteristics of deep autoencoder is that it receives high-dimensional signal as an input, and then abstract the information into the middle layer so that it can reconstruct the original high-dimensional signal as an output. And using this deep autoencoder, we train the robot to learn to reach for an object. During the learning, the robot can acquire the visual, tactile, and proprioceptive signals. The vision from the camera, the tactile sensation from the hand, and the proprioceptive signals from the body. And using these three modality signals, the robot first learned to predict the original input signal. This is a process of the minimization of prediction error. The learning for reaching itself is not so difficult. We can utilize the back propagations to update the network. The important point is the next step, how this network can be utilized for predicting the other robot, the reaching behavior. To test it, we then introduce the second robot, who is now reaching for an object. And the first robot, which learned the network, is just observing the second robot. So observation means that this robot can receive only the visual signal as an input, no tactile or no proprioceptive signals. But thanks to the multimodal representations, which is acquired in the deep autoencoder, we can expect that this network would predict not only the visual signal, but also tactile and proprioceptive signal as an imaginary signal. And these imaginary signals can be utilized as a next time step imaginary input to the network, so that this imaginary signal would enhance the predictions of their actual visual signal. And with this architecture, we thought that it can utilize their own motor experiences. The internal model, which was acquired through the own motor experiences, can now utilize to better predict the other person's behaviors, which is analogous to the mirror neuron function. So to test our hypothesis, we designed the two experimental conditions. In the first condition, the network was trained through their sensory motor experiences. So the robot received visual, tactile, and proprioceptive signals to update the network. In another condition, the robot learned the same network, but using only the visual signal through the observation. Through the observation, the robot can only see another robot behaviors. So the visual signal is only the signals to update the network. And this graph shows how accurately the network could predict another robot behavior. And by comparing these two results, you can see that the action generation conditions could drastically and significantly improve the accuracy of the predictions. the green bar indicating that the collect goal predictions gradually improves as the learning proceeds. Whereas the action observation conditions, although their accuracy improved a little bit, even only with their visual signal, but then their accuracy was not high enough compared to their action generations. So why these differences happen? To gain better insight into the internal model, we analyzed the activations of the middle layer of the neural network. We applied a principal component analysis to visualize the middle layer of the network. Here, the 3 lines corresponds to the 3 reaching behaviors, reaching for left, reaching for center, and reaching for right. As you can see that in the action generation condition, the robot could acquire very well-structured the internal representation. The 3 different reaching behaviors are well separated in the internal representation. In contrast, the action observation condition, the network sometimes confused the different reaching behaviors, so the mixture of their internal representation indicate how difficult for this network to make the predictions. We think that this is a very nice insight into the understanding of how the mirror neuron-like architectures can be acquired using the neural network model. And then we tested whether this mirror neuron-like architecture can generate their cooperative behavior or altruistic behaviors. We implement this architecture into robots, and then we let the robot whether to help the other person based on the prediction error. In this scenario, first the robot learned the 2 motor primitives. The one is to push the blue car, and the second is to cover the red marker. And after learning these 2 action primitives, the robot now observing the human behaviors and then calculating the discrepancy between the predicted sensory signal and the actual sensory signal. And as you can see in the bottom right, the prediction error is calculated in real time. And once the robot detects a certain level of prediction error, this becomes a trigger for robots to generate its own motor behaviors. So the minimization of prediction error here is the motivation for robots to change the world. And as a result, we could observe that this very simple mechanism enabled the robot to show their altruistic and very sophisticated social behavior. So from this result, we can suggest that the social behavior could emerge based on the very simple, unified architecture of the minimization of prediction error. And then we applied the same idea to another scenario. Here it's an emotion, the cohesion and emotion estimation. In this scenario, we utilized the merge model deep belief network, which basically has the same function with the deep autoencoder. In this setup, the robot is sitting face-to-face with the human caregiver, and then the human caregiver is showing their different facial expressions and also their speech signal. And using their visual and the auditory signal, the network were learned to minimize the prediction error. Again, the network receives their high-dimensional merge model signal as an input, and then first extract their more important informations in the higher layer. And what this network is to do is to reconstruct the original, their input, the high-dimensional signal, and then the error between the predicted signal and the incoming, the actual sensory signal is utilized to update the network. Please note that there is no teaching signal, like a label of the emotion here. So first we examined how the emotional state is differentiated over the learning. We applied the principal component analysis to the highest layer of the network and then observed how the different emotional expressions are gradually separated in the space. Here, the color marker corresponds to the different emotional state. Black corresponds to joy, red corresponds to surprise, and so on. And in the very early stage of development, you can see that their different emotions are not well separated well. They are confused and there is no clear state of the emotion yet. And as learning process, you can see that their different emotions are gradually separated. And finally, we could observe the two-dimensional space corresponding to pleasant and arousal here, which are also observed in the human, the emotional state. So this is a first step, how the sensory-motor experiences enable robots to acquire the different emotional state in their internal model. Then again, the next question is how this internal model can be utilized to better estimate the other person's their emotional state. So after training the network, we then gave only their auditory signal to the network and then tested how and whether the network can make their predictions of their invisible, their unobservable visual signal, and then whether it can better estimate their emotional state. Here again, their internal representation of the network after the learning. And then we closely looked at how the estimation of the emotional state gradually changes as the network utilizes the imaginary, their visual signal as an input. The first estimation was far from their truth value, but then as you can see that by repeating their reconstruction of their imaginary visual signal and then utilizing them as an input signal together with the auditory signal, the network could improve the accuracy of the estimation. And then around their 20 steps of the estimation, their estimated state get closer to the truth value. So with this experiment, again, we could confirm that their prediction ability can better contribute to the better estimations of the other person's internal state and also their facilitate the social interaction. So the first part was about their continuity of the development, how the social behaviors can emerge based on non-social sensory motor experiences. The second part, I'd like to focus on the diversity in the development. Why and how some children show the difficulties in acquiring the social cognition. As an example of atypical development, here I'd like to focus on the autism spectrum disorder. The autism spectrum disorder has been characterized by their social deficit. For example, there's children often show the difficulties in communicating with others. They have their difficulties in reading the other person's emotional state or reading the intention of others. However, the neuroscience and the cognitive science studies suggest that the high level, their social, their difficulties may be caused by the lower level, the cognitive difficulties. Researchers suggest that the people with autism often have their limited abilities in the understanding the global context. For example, this is the case of the visual perception. When people see this kind of letters, their typical developed persons tend to first look at a global pictures of the image, while their persons with ASD often first look at the local features, and then they have difficulties in switching their local and global attentions. I think that the social abilities also require their abilities to have their global pictures of the world and also to better infer their internal state of others. And then we started thinking, how and to what extent the predictive coding theory could explain the underlying neural mechanism for autism spectrum disorder. Here are the same pictures from the previous slide. We again introduce the predictive coding, the mechanism, as a basis for the neural mechanism. Here, the difference between the typical development and autism spectrum disorder seems to be explained by the difference between their pliers, how accurately the persons can utilize or generate their own plier. One well-known theory is called hypoplier hypothesis. The neuroscientists have been suggesting that aberrant precisions of top-down predictions might be a cause for autism spectrum disorder. Here, the yellow Gaussian distributions has larger variance, which indicating their weak plier. And with this weak plier, the persons with ASD seems to have often the hypersensitivity to the sensory signals. This is a very nice starting point. However, we don't know yet whether this theory can account for the diversity in the autism. We know from the behavioral studies that even in the autism group, there are many different difficulties in the cognitive behaviors. So to investigate further the underlying mechanism for autism spectrum disorder, we again designed the neural network model, which nicely integrate the Bayesian inference idea. Here we utilize the stochastic continuous time recurrent neural network model, which was originally proposed by Murata et al. And then we integrated the Bayesian inference module here. As in the normal recurrent neural network model, this network also predicts the next time step signal using the current time step signal. But the first additional function is to predict not only the mean, but also the variance of the sensory signal. And using the variance of the sensory signal, we can realize the Bayesian inference here. Using the prior from the predictions and also the incoming sensory signal, we make the posterior here, which is utilized as input for the context layer. Using this network, we tested our extended hypothesis, whether not only the hypoplier, but also the hyperplier may account for the diversity in autism. So here is the normal plier, and the neuroscience hypothesis suggests that the hypoplier might be a cause of the autism spectrum disorder. But from inspired by the behavior studies, we newly suggested that the hyperplier might account the different types of difficulties in autism. So to test this hypothesis, we designed a very interesting studies, which is a representational drawing. Representational drawing is also often utilized in the child study because children cannot tell their cognitive processes by themselves. So using this drawing behavior, we can gain their insight into their cognitive processes. So using this representational drawing as a task, we trained the recurrent neural network with the abilities of the Bayesian integrations. So here the training data were designed as 6 different types of the drawing patterns, like a face, house, cars, flower, human, and rockets. And after training these 6 types of the patterns, we tested the network whether the network can make predictions of the missing parts. We provided only the first 33% of the trajectory to the network, and then let the network first infer the intended patterns and then make predictions for the missing parts. Here, in order to separate the 6 different patterns, we design the initial state for the context layer so that the network, only the single network, can learn to differentiate the 6 different drawing patterns. So here is an example of their trajectory. The black line showing their given trajectory to the network, and green line shows their predictions by the network. Using the given parts, the network first infer what is the intended pattern, and then based on their inference, the network made the predictions for the missing parts. And here the questions again is that how the aberrant the precisions of the prior would affect the learning performance. So to do so, we introduce the parameter h here, which can manipulate the variance of the prior prediction. And then by modulating the h value, we could observe how the aberrant and hyper or hyperplier would generate the autism-like behavior. So here is the first result of the behaviors. We manipulated the h value from the very small value, which corresponds to hyperplier, to larger value corresponding to hypopliers. Let's first look at the normal plier, h equals 1. As you can see, the network were very successful in generating the target behaviors. For face, house, car, and so on, you can see that their network could nicely reproduce their drawing trajectories. In contrast, when their network had hyperplier, we often observed that the network misinterpreted the intended pattern. For example, in this case, we intended the car as an outline. However, the network inferred this as a face and then generated the face features as a result. Or in this case, this was the intended for rocket, but result looks similar to the humans. So this kind of the misinterpretations were often observed in their hyperplier networks. And then comparing with hyperplier network, we can find a very interesting result. In case of hyperplier, the network often showed scribbling behaviors. So you can see that only the existing lines were nicely followed, but then their missing parts were not generated at all. We could also confirm that statistically there are difficulties in their drawing behaviors. So here you can see kind of U-shape in their prediction errors. Only with the normal plier, the network were very successful in learning the target patterns. So why this happens? What happens in their internal representation of the network? Again, we closely analyzed their internal representation of the network. We applied the principal component analysis to their hidden layer neurons. Here you can see the 3 colored lines, the red, yellow, and blue, which corresponds to face, house, and the flowers. And as you can see in the middle here, these 3 lines are nicely separated when the network parameter was 1, which corresponds to the normal plier. So as you have seen in the previous slide, the normal pliers network were very successful in generating the target behaviors. So such successful behaviors are again confirmed with the very nicely separated attractors in the internal model. Here you can see the red and the yellow trajectory are a little bit overlapped, but this is because their face and the house patterns the outlines were similar to each other. And these similarities between the face and house, they strongly impacted the internal representation of the hyperplier network. So this is the internal representation of the hyperpliers, and you can see that the face and house were completely overlapping. If you remember, the behavior output also showed the misinterpretation of the intended pattern. So such a misinterpretation seems to be caused by this, they overlapped their network attractors, because the hyperplier network tries to utilize its own network dynamics. So even if the incoming sensory signal changes, but the network still utilizes its own network dynamics. That's why the different patterns are also included in the one big attractor that cause the confusions or misinterpretation in the intended behaviors. In contrast, the network with hypoplier, we observed that the network could not acquire any attractors corresponding to the different behavior patterns. It shows like an one by one different trajectories, but then it could not create like a face attractor or household attractor and so on. We thought that this is the cause of their scraping behaviors, because the network with hypoplier was very strongly relying on the incoming sensory signal. The network does not utilize its own network dynamics. Then the network could follow only the existing line, but for the missing part, the network did not have any idea what the intended pattern is. Then the network showed a kind of random behavior as a result. We can also test their outcomes using our robot. So here in the interaction scenario, first the person draw their one patterns of the behaviors, and then let the robot first infer the intended patterns. Here you can see the internal representation of the network. In the first case, the person intended to draw their face, and so you can see that their small red dots gradually appear here, which nicely corresponds to the face attractor. You can also observe that the robot drawing is now displayed on here, and it first follows the existing outer lines and then start going into the details. Here is the camera view from the robot side. You can see that how different pliers would affect the different behaviors. In case of normal plier, robot was successful in drawing the missing parts. Here in this case, their eyes and mouth were missing, so the robot now gradually drawing the missing parts. In case of hypoplier, the robot showed the scraping behaviors. So like this, like young children, the robot did the random behavior because it could not infer the intended patterns. This is a very simple demonstration. Actually, the robot was directly controlled by the network output, so the robot did not really draw something on the display because it cannot really touch the display. But then using this kind of setup, we thought that we can design the human-robot interaction experiment in order to see how the social partners' behavior would also affect their perception and also the learning of another partner. So now we started designing the human-robot interaction experiment to further investigate the effect of the social interactions on their predictive coding. And then inspired by their neural network study, we also tested whether the human child would acquire their internal representation and also their representational drawing ability like our network model. So we designed a very similar experiment with human child. Using the tablet, we showed the 33% of the trajectories and then let the child to draw something on it. They were freely drawing something on the tablet as they like. We collected the data from more than 100 children and more than 600 drawing patterns. Here are some results. As you can see that the small children tended to do the scribbling as their network model. So these are the example. Although their input signal are changing, there depends on the context. However, their small children often just do some random their behaviors on doing it. Or some other children show the coloring behavior to fill out their empty space, or the other children that show the tracing behaviors like this. And only their older children could show their completion abilities, as we have observed in the normal plier network. This is adult patterns, just for an example. You can see that the adults are very creative, so they can generate the more different types of the completion abilities. So then we quantitatively evaluated the developmental change in the drawing behavior. First, we asked the human later to assess their improvement in the completion ability. In the experiment, we had 3 conditions. The first one is outline condition, only their contours of the object is displayed on the tablet. Or the inner feature conditions, only the inner parts like the facial, their mouth, eyes are shown on the tablet. And the scrambled inner conditions, inner feature conditions, we showed the inner features in the random positions. Our expectation is that the scrambled inner feature condition would be more difficult for small children. So then we would not observe so much the improvement in their completion abilities. But interestingly, we could observe very nicely the linear improvement in their completion ability, regardless of the conditions, even in the scrambled the inner feature conditions. We think that the human children were so creative, so even with the different positions, they tried to draw for example, the multiple face to make the sense about their input signal. And then we next utilize the convolutional neural network to further investigate the internal representation or the categories of the object. We utilized the deep convolutional network, which were pre-trained using the natural image. And then we fed their child drawing the image into the network to obtain their activities of the higher layer of the neurons. And this matrix above shows their similarities or dissimilarities between their neural activations of the different image patterns. When the matrix shows the darker color, it indicates that the different signals and also the different images were close to each other. When the matrix shows the higher color, then it indicates that the different objects were separated in their neural activations. So as you can see, with age, the increase, the differentiation gets clearer and clearer. And at about 67 months old or older, they acquired adult-like categorization of the different objects. This is nicely indicating that how the internal representation or the pliers of the different objects are gradually created as their child develops. Although this does not directly assess their children's neural or their cognitive processes, but by analyzing their drawing behaviors, we can observe how the different objects are represented as different pliers or separated pliers. So let me conclude. In this talk, I introduced the ideas called predictive coding as a unified principle for human cognitive development. In the human cognitive development, we have to think about the 2 important aspects. The first one is the continuity in the development, how social behaviors emerge based on non-social sensory motor experiences. And the second important aspect is the diversity. Why some children shows the typical development, whereas the other shows their atypical patterns, like an autism spectrum disorders. And as a unified the neural mechanism, we propose that the predictive coding or the minimization of the prediction error can explain that the diversity and also the continuity of the development can be consistently explained by the neural network model. So here I'd like to summarize what we found from our computational and behavioral studies based on the predictive coding. Again, there are one important ideas of predictive coding is Bayesian inference, how our top-down predictions is integrated with our bottom-up sensory signal. And according to the predictive coding theory, the brain follows the Bayesian inference. And first, from the developmental study and also the neural network study, we could first observe that the process of acquiring the normal pliers corresponds to their typical or atypical development. And then we observed that in young children, it seems that the children often have weak pliers or very context-specific pliers, which result in their immaturity in the behavior. Because the young children have much less experiences about the world. So their plier knowledges are still immature. So it has a larger uncertainty than the normal types. Or sometimes the children seems to create a very specific, context-specific pliers, which also resulted in the very top-down oriented behaviors. Regardless of the input signal, some children often shows their very prototypical behaviors, which might be well explained by their context-specific pliers. And then we first observed that if they follow the typical development, they would first acquire the normal plier like this. And once they acquire the normal plier, it can be utilized for the social behaviors. Here, I would like to explain how the mirror neuron system would contribute to more accurately infer their intention or internal state of others. When we are observing and also interacting with others, we can receive only the limited sensory signals about their others. We can just observe the other person's behaviors, like a visual signal. In this case, their sensory signals have their larger uncertainty than in their self-oriented behaviors. And then their procedure based on this very uncertain sensory signal would be biased to our plier. This is the case of without the mirror neuron system. But once we utilize the mirror neuron system, this posterior changes and it becomes more accurate than before. Using the mirror neuron system and also the plier predictions, we can infer and also make the imaginary sensory signal about the world. Even if we are missing some modality sensory signals, we can imagine what the other signals would look like based on the actual sensory input. And the more accurate sensory signal will contribute to more accurate posterior. So the function of the mirror neuron system can be accounted for as a process to make the more accurate the posterior using their Bayesian inference. And then we further investigated why and what happens in their atypical development, like an autism spectrum disorders. From the neural network study, we observed that not only hypoplier, but also hyperplier show the different types of difficulties observed in autism. In case of hypopliers, people often show the weak generalization abilities. They cannot utilize their own pliers, their own experiences for the new environment. Or in case of hyperplier, they show their poor adaptability. When they go to the new environment, they cannot utilize their previous experiments. So I think the underlying neural mechanism or underlying the predictive processing seems to be different. Their outcomes shows the similar types of the difficulties in the social behaviors. This is still non-hypothetical, the ideas. We need to further investigate to what extent the predictive coding theory can account for the diversity and also the continuity in development. But I hope that this summary would also help to think about what kind of mechanism you can generate, you can develop for your robot. And this is the final slide. Again, the most important message of my talk is the predictive coding as a unified account for cognitive development. Once we know such an unified account, we can, of course, better understand the human intelligence, but also we can better design the robot intelligence. Once the robot has a predictive coding mechanism, it can acquire not only the one action or one behavior, but also many different behaviors in a continuous manner, or also the open-ended manner. So I hope that our approach would help you to design the more sophisticated and the more stronger, the intelligent mechanism for robots in the future. I'd like to thank my colleagues, and also I'd like to thank you for watching my talks in these videos. So thank you very much again for watching these videos. And although we cannot have the live discussion this time, but we are very much looking forward to seeing you in the future conferences and also welcoming you in a lab in Tokyo. If you have a chance to visit Tokyo, we are very happy to have you in the lab and to have the closer discussion of our ideas. Thank you very much.